particularly. Michael Tapa is our speaker today. He's from Philadelphia. He's had a varied career working for Ask Jeeves at Georgetown, Stanford in Palo Alto, and University of Pennsylvania, other such places, E-Trade, Ask Jeeves. He's a Ruby guy, Java, Python, Perl, and of course he's very conversant with PHP and WordPress. So without further ado, I introduce Michael Tapa, and he'll take it from here.
So usually title slides are not very interesting, but this one's kind of fun to look at. This is sort of the theme of the talk. And this is, you know, the cartoonist is upset about other people's code. But really this can also be about your own code. 6 months later, when you've forgotten why you did that, what you're thinking you did 6 months earlier, and you're trying to understand it. So I'm here to tell you that it doesn't have to be this way. How can we avoid these situations? So I was going to tell you a little bit about me, but you just heard all that, so I will skip ahead. So before we start, I'm going to do a little bit of shameless self-promotion. I work for a civic engagement startup called Elect Next. We're here to get people politically informed and engaged. We're nonpartisan. And just a few days ago, we put our WordPress plugin up on WordPress.org. And what we do is we provide political profiles of politicians that you can embed in a post. So this would be for media sites, political bloggers, and we get all this data that's out there, and it's available through various data sources on campaign finance, legislation they're introducing, voting records. Pull that together so to make it easy for people to read and understand. This is your U.S. Senator, or one of your 2 U.S. Senators, Bob Corker. You can see the industries where he's getting his money from. We also go down to the local level. Local data is the hardest to get, so we're going state by state, starting in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. If you're involved with politics or media in Tennessee, come talk to me. Maybe we'll in Tennessee up the list. This is one of the city council members in Philadelphia named Bill Green. This is where he got his campaign donations from. And we'll be adding more and more to this in the coming months. So I just wanted to show you a little bit of that. That's the front end. Back end, it's a meta box that goes in the post editor, and you can see we've got a post here, which is really just a news article. And if the Wi-Fi works for me, I can scan the article. So what's happening here is the data that's stored in WordPress is actually very minimal. We're just sorting IDs for the politicians. All the rest is happening through third-party JavaScript. Those profiles you saw on the front end, we're injecting those in real time into the site. It's just how DiscussWorks or Google Analytics. So when we scan the article, we're actually running this against our database of more than 10,000 politicians and looking for their names. And then we can embed them in their profiles into your posts. You can also search for them by name, rearrange them if you like. Just wanted to let everyone see that was out there. And this is actually this plugin is a great sort of use case for clean code. Let me get my slides back up. So the technology stacks that powers it. You saw the WordPress plugin piece of it for embedding and displaying profiles. On our site, likenext.com, we're running a Ruby on Rails application that is doing that, providing all that data that's fed into it. And we're using third-party JavaScript to inject the profiles in real time. And a project like this would be a nightmare without clean code. I mean, there are days I've worked on this where I'm like, okay, I'm in PHP, I'm in WordPress, I'm in Ruby on Rails. Now I'm in JSON JavaScript. I'm like, your head almost spins. It's like trying to talk to someone in Chinese and another person in French and someone in Italian all at once. But keeping the code clean, keeping it well organized, coming up with design principles that work really across languages really helps in managing something that's this complicated. So what does this talk about? Clean code sounds Sounds nice, but sort of an ambiguous kind of phrase. So the title of the talk and the schedule was Clean Code for WordPress plugins. So it's a little dishonest in the title, because if you saw my first slide, actually you said Clean Code for WordPress. I put plugins in there because I wanted to get developers in the room, because that's my current audience. I'm not going to really say much specifically about plugins, though. You know, talks before me, like we talked about custom layouts in the first talk, and the custom field managers. There are lots of good resources for those things that are really unique to WordPress. So I'm not here to talk about that either. So what am I here to talk about? I'm here to talk about the broad principles of clean code, ideas that apply across languages, across development frameworks. And these are things that will help you in your work in WordPress and work you may do beyond WordPress. So what is clean code? So one other thing I'm not here to talk about is code formatting. I'm not here to talk about parentheses and curly braces and indentation. If you go on the WordPress Codex, there's very clear guidelines for how code should be formatted for WordPress. I encourage you to follow those guidelines. I'm here to get some deeper concepts than that. So, clean code. There's a great book called Clean Code. And in that book, the author goes and talks to various luminaries in the software development community and asks them the question, what do you think clean code is? And we get some really interesting answers. This one is from Jarne Straustup, who's the inventor of C++. He said clean code does one thing well. It's sort of interesting, because we're writing code, we're trying to do a bunch of different things usually. He says it does one thing well. Gary Booch, who's a chief scientist at IBM, this clean code reads like well-written prose. Wouldn't that be nice? Huh? So like reading Lord of the Rings, reading like those. Dave Thomas, who's the founder of Object Technology International, so they can be read and enhanced by a developer other than its original author. That's a pretty nice benchmark. If you can look at that code your coworker wrote and just know what it means without having to ask the why questions. Michael Feathers, who's the author of a great book called Working Effectively with Legacy Code, says that clean code always looks like it was written by someone who cares. This one's actually my favorite. Again, it's very abstract, but it's sort of like you can read the code and tell somebody really thought about this and wanted to do a good job. Ron Jeffries, who's co-creator of the XP development process, says it contains no duplication. You may have heard of do not repeat yourself. Many people consider code duplication the root of all evil. As soon as you copy and paste your code into somewhere else, if there was one bug in the original code, now you've got 2 bugs in 2 different places. And now you've got 1 bug 2 times instead of once. Ward Cunningham was the inventor of wikis. This clean code turns out to be pretty much what you expected. Now, how often does that happen? You open up a file you've never looked at before, and you're trying to figure it out, and it's just like, oh yeah, that's totally clear. I know exactly what this is. Wouldn't it be nice to have that? So how can we get there? How do we have that? First, you have to change your mindset a little bit. So everything I just said, you can say, well, that sounds nice, but I have a deadline. I don't have time to write clean code. I don't have time to sit there and ponder my variable names and rewrite my functions to be just so. I've got to get stuff done. I've got to deliver deadlines. So my counter-argument to that mindset is, do you want your emergency room doctor to rush your surgery? Do you want your accountant to rush to work on your tax return? These people are in a hurry too, especially like an emergency room. They gotta go. They're trying to save you. But when the pressure's on the most is when you most want your doctor to adhere to his best principles, right? Don't do a good job. And these other professions have principles and practices that they follow. Doctors take the Hippocratic oath to do no harm. Accountants are expected to do double entry bookkeeping. If they didn't, they would probably lose their licenses as accountants. So these kinds of professions have standards for it. It means to practice their profession safely and responsibly. So there's a movement called the software craftsmanship the purpose of it is to try to start a conversation about what it means for programmers to write code responsibly and cleanly. You don't have to agree with the ideas I'm going to talk about here. What's important is to engage with them and have the conversation. And if you look at a lot of these other professions out there, doctors, lawyers, plumbers, they have all kinds of degrees, certifications, government regulations they have to follow. So far, the software industry's been pretty lucky. We don't have that kind of regulation. But there are many, including me, who are concerned that that's going to come. We don't do a better job setting our own professional standards. You may remember last summer, like Capital, which is a company that traded stocks, lost $440 million in a matter of hours because somebody didn't do proper testing of their software. There's software embedded in medical devices, in gas stations, everywhere you look, there's software. So we don't do a good job managing this, having clean and well-written code. The government will do it for us, and maybe not do it as nicely as we would like by bringing a big bureaucracy into the equation. So something to think about. So clean code. Clean code is adaptable code. Usually we rush because we're in a hurry, or we write fast and dirty code. And maybe at the beginning we are going pretty fast, but as the project goes on, that code starts to resemble a big bowl of mud. And it makes it harder and harder to work with as it gets messier and messier. So we're trying to go faster, but ultimately we end up going slower because we're rushing. So why does that happen exactly? The key reason is that the ratio of time spent reading code versus writing code is well over 10 to 1. They've actually done studies on this, watching programmers work and seeing what they're doing. And they spend most of their time opening files, scrolling up and down, going back to another file, trying to understand all the stuff they're looking at. So they're trying to sort of cut through what is usually poorly written code, trying to understand it. So if you take a little more time to write your code well, making code easy to read makes code easier to write. Because ultimately what you're there to do is produce more code. But what's interesting, even though we do spend our time mostly reading code, most of us actually aren't aware of that. When I learned this, I was actually surprised by it. This is a great quote from Douglas Crockford, who's the principal discoverer of JSON. We like to think we spend our time power typing, but we actually spend most of our time staring through the bit. And that's true. So I mean, think about that. Think about the hours you spend debugging or trying to figure out someone else's code or your own code. So when you're trying to decide whether you spend a little more time writing your code cleanly, remember an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So that's all sort of set up, some conceptual ideas. The rest of my talk, I'm going to go through 10 ways to make your code clean. Number one is a mindset sort of thing, that you are responsible for the quality of your code. It's not your project manager's responsibility, it's not your boss's responsibility, it's not your client's responsibility, it's yours. What if you were in a hurry and you went to your doctor, you're like, come on doc, I don't have time for this appointment, don't bother washing your hands, let's go. We would hope your doctor would say, I'm sorry, I have to do this, I have to practice my profession responsibly. And that should be your attitude as a programmer as well. Part of being a professional is being honest about how long it takes to do something well and not accepting the option to do it wrong. Number two is to work in short cycles. Now this may seem a little odd because this is about code directly, this is more about workflow. But it very much relates to how your code turns out when you write it. You're developing systems in small portions at a time, which is incrementally, do a little bit at a time, and you're doing it through repeated cycles, which are iterative cycles, you're slowly building up the feature set. By doing that, when you do that, you can take advantage of what you learned in each cycle. You you're working in small pieces, getting feedback from your coworkers, from your clients, whoever you're working with, you know, am I approaching this the right way? Is there a better way to do this? This helps keep your code clean, clear, and understandable. So the general idea here is you're working on one thing, you're doing it well, you're working on a small piece, and then you move on to the next piece. And if you take that mindset and sort of follow it all the way up to the project life cycle, you get a workflow that looks something like this. This is an outline of what's called an agile workflow, which would be a completely separate talk for me to give, so I won't go through it in detail. And maybe not all of these steps are applicable to the kind of work that you're doing, but the idea is you're constantly getting feedback as you work, whether it's from another programmer you're working with, or tests that you're writing, or a check-in meeting you're having on a daily basis. All the way up through the cycle of the project, you're getting feedback. So that's what a project with these feedback cycles looks like. A project without them looks a little more like this. You don't want to have this kind of relationship with your clients. You don't want to have this kind of relationship with your code. Number 3 is to use meaningful names. This image is actually written out for how you should name your variables and your functions. What's in the bucket? Well, it's a cheetah, and we called it a cheetah. There's no ambiguity here. What this is about. So the name of a variable, function, or class should tell you why it exists and what it does. This is not a good variable name. I mean, imagine, you know, a script filled with these little D's and X's and whatever. By the time as you're reading the code, you're mentally juggling. You're trying to remember what all these little squiggles mean. It's much harder to focus on the main thing, which is understanding the logic of the program. The days when it was important to use short variable names to save memory space are long gone. Code editors now have auto-completion, so it should not be extra work for you to type out a longer name. I would strongly encourage you to use an editor invented sometime after 1972. And for things like JavaScript code, where minification is important, you know, you don't want to be sending large files over the wire to someone's browser. There are automated minification tools that can shrink the code for you when it's delivered. So on the development side, you can still have easy to read code. So here's some better names. Pretty easy to understand these. I'm not interested in arguing about camel case versus underscores, so I gave examples of both. But the point is, you know, that quote earlier about well-written prose, well, these are your nouns. It's clear what they mean. So again, keeping that idea of code reading like well-written prose, if those are our nouns, our functions give us our verbs and our sentences. So I put this code up here. This is a function I grabbed pretty much at random from one of my WordPress plugins. It's a method from a class, and even if you don't know object-oriented programming, that's fine. Just take out the word public and pretend the word this and the arrow isn't there. And it can read pretty much like a regular function. So if you take just a moment to look through this, it should be fairly clear what's going on. I guess I should give you a little bit of context at least, which is this is for a plugin I wrote that displays photos like from Picasa, and you can adjust the sizes of the thumbnails that are shown. So hopefully you can look at this and read it and understand what it means without having to scratch your head too much. And there's one thing you don't see in this code, something that's not here. And what's not there is number 5, comments. Comments are a red flag. So this is a controversial one. I used to comment like crazy. Lots and lots of comments. I want to document my code. I want everyone to understand it. So learning these clean code techniques was a revelation to me that clean code itself, the code itself can be expressive. I don't have to rely on the comments to explain the code, that it really can read like well-written prose. So when you're writing lots of comments, the comments become another thing that you have to maintain, another thing to keep track of and do work on. And often comments get neglected as the project evolves. And eventually the comments get out of date, or they're in the wrong place. And now instead of being helpful, they're actually dangerous lies, telling you something that used to be true, but is now false. And someone would read the comment and say, oh, well, it's this. And then they don't even look at the code. And now they've completely misunderstood what's actually going on. So having said that, comments definitely do have their place. I'm not saying never write comments. You often do need comments to explain to you why you did something. There may be context that's not obvious from just looking at the code. So there are definitely very valid cases for using comments. But my point is, when you find yourself about to write a comment, you should stop and think about it for a second. Instead of just writing a comment, you should ask yourself the question, is there something I can do in this code that would make it clearer so someone can just look at the code and understand it and not have to read my comment and read the code? Number 6 is the Boy Scout rule. This is from Boy Scouts, leave the campground cleaner than you found it. This can also apply to code. Leave your code cleaner than you found. A common occurrence in software projects is this idea of bit run. That over time the code gets messier and buggier, and many developers just sort of assume that that's inevitable. This is what happens with every project. But if we have code that just keeps getting cleaner over time, instead of messier over time, and this is what the Boy Scout rule is there to help you do. So if you write your new code, and keep your new code clean, and while you're working on it, spend a few minutes and clean up the code that relates to the code that you're working on or is near it, improve a variable name, break up a function that's too big, eliminate a small bit of duplication, things like that. And this very much relates to do not repeat yourself, which I wanted to put in here, but that would be 11, and I wanted to keep the list of 10. So like, this very much relates to that idea of do not repeat yourself. If you're seeing duplication in the code, here's an opportunity to clean that up, extract it out. And the most common objection to do not repeat yourself as well, I've got something I'm working on here, and I've got this new thing I want to do here that's 80% the same, so I'm just going to copy and paste, and then just change the 20% I need to change. The reason not to do that is, first of all, you've got this duplication, like I was saying before. Now, if there are bugs or things you need to change, you're going to change them in 2 places. So how do you solve that problem if something is similar but not 100% the same? And the answer is to break it up. Take the parts that are the same, break those out into their own functions, reuse those, and then the 20% that's unique, that should be the only thing that's new. But the basic idea here with the Boy Scout rule, a good analogy is like your garden. You keep it healthy and looking nice by weeding it for 10 minutes every day. So waiting until it's a huge overgrown mess. Number 7, single responsibility principle. This is an idea from object-oriented programming. There's a set of principles called the solid principles. So single responsibility principle is the S of the solid. Those 5 principles. But it applies even if you're not doing object-oriented programming. And the idea is that when you're working on a function or a method or a class, it should do one thing, it should do it well, and it should do it only. But what does it mean to do just one thing? If you're talking about functions or methods, this typically means changing the value of only one variable. If you pass one thing in, you change that, and that's all that function does. It's small, it's focused, it's clear what it's doing. If you're passing 2 or 3 or more arguments into a function or a method, you're probably doing more than one thing. Just by 2, 3, 4 arguments going in, the matrix of possibilities of outcomes from that function starts to become very complicated. So the fewer arguments you can pass in, the clearer it is what that function is doing, and the lower the likelihood of obscure bugs creeping in. And the same sort of concept applies with classes. If you think about classes, they're really a collection of functions that operate on a set of shared properties. So those relationships should be focused, and there should be what's called high cohesiveness between them. Most of the functions are manipulating most of the properties. If you start to see a split, like half the functions are So this is the same method I had up before. So does this method follow the single responsibility? It accepts one argument, so that's good. Just one argument coming in. And it's changing only one value. It's setting the value of numeric thumbnail size. Only thing here that changes. So that's good. And there are no side effects. There's no like, oh, and by the way, it changes another thing, even though you can't tell from the method name. You know, there's no little surprises in there. It's got these if, else blocks. That's kind of a red flag. That's sort of like there's multiple possibilities going on here. But within each of them, there's really just one line of code. There really wouldn't be much value in breaking this up any further. It really can't be broken down much further. So again, there's always sort of a judgment call here, and it just comes from experience of working with these things. You say, well, is this good enough? Have I done a good job here? That's number 7. Number 8. So I've laid out these principles and all these different ideas. So this is just sort of a word of caution on it all, which is to not overdo it. Avoid needless complexity. So the most sort of biggest and most complicated WordPress plugin I have is called Shashin. It's for displaying photos from Picasa, videos from YouTube. It works with these different services so you can display them easily in your plugins. Shashin is a Japanese word. And I came up with a name in like 2005 before it was cool to name everything with a Japanese name. So in that plugin, I have 44 classes and subclasses. So there's a lot of abstraction in there. And in the case of that plugin, it provides that level of abstraction is justified. There's a certain complexity in the setup, but it makes it really easy. Like if I want to add, Flickr, I just drop in a subclass. I don't have to go rewrite tons of different sections of the plugin. It's very easy to just modularly add different components. If I want to add, high slide or pre-photos of viewer, I can just drop it in and everything just works. So in a case like that level of complexity and abstraction is justified. But if I knew I didn't need that, like if I knew from the beginning this is just for Picasa, this is just for pre-photo, I'm never going to need anything else, there really wouldn't be any reason to write so many classes. The point of having abstraction, of having subclasses and interfaces and these sorts of things is to have flexibility around the things that can change in an application. If something's not going to change, there's no reason to add that level of abstraction. Or you add it later once the change comes up. So number 9, this is going to be the most controversial one. So why am I subjecting you to this horrible negative? It's the idea of independent architecture. Actually, it's bothering me too. I'm going to skip to the next slide. I've been involved with the WordPress community for many years, and I feel like I'm it's a sort of big part of my life. My first WordCamp was Philly WordCamp a couple of years ago, and the energy and enthusiasm of everybody there really pulled me in. But I'm also part of other communities as well. I work at Ruby on Rails right now. I'm very interested in sort of agile software practices that apply across software development platforms. So what am I talking about when I say independent architecture? This is a great quote from Bob Martin from a blog post he wrote called Screaming Architecture. And he says, software architectures are structures that support the use cases of the system. Frameworks are tools to be used, not architectures to be conformed to. So what is he talking about here? In our situation, WordPress is the framework. We're developing within WordPress. That's our development framework. So to translate that for our situation, WordPress is a tool to be used, not an architecture to be conformed to. So when you look at a WordPress plugin, the structure and organization of that plugin shouldn't be screaming at you, I'm a WordPress plugin. It should be screaming at you, I'm here for photo management. I'm here for whatever it is that plugin does. What you've written is a piece of software which happens to work with WordPress. So you should be thinking of the software that you're working on and what it's there for, the use cases of your plugin, and structure it around those use cases. For the plugin I was just talking about, Shasheen, my photo management plugin, when I wrote it, I thought this would be useful outside of WordPress. Like this could work in any, I would like this to work in any PHP environment. So there are parts of it that are very tightly glued to WordPress, like it works with the media manager. That's a very specific WordPress thing. You don't see that other places. So that piece of the code is very much tied to WordPress. But then the other parts, you could pretty much pull them out and drop it in and use it somewhere else. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. So why is this important? Why does this matter? I wrote a blog post about this a few weeks ago called Community and Architecture. So WordPress as an architecture that's causing its best practices to diverge from the best practices of the broader software industry. And this is something that concerns me. That architecture is completely understandable. WordPress is almost 10 years old. It was written at a time when PHP did not have a good object model. You know, the kinds of things I'm talking about are WordPress itself relies very heavily on global variables. Singleton pattern is emerging as like a best practice for plugins, which is something that the broader software community tends to not use that pattern very much because there are a lot of problems with it. And in WordPress, you know, they talk about having unit tests for WordPress, but they're not really unit tests. They're integration tests. These things may not matter. Some of the stuff I'm talking about may not be on your radar screen. But my main point is that it's driving a set of practices in WordPress plugin development and other aspects of WordPress development that really don't match where the rest of the software industry is going. And the WordPress community is so big, which is a great thing that it's big and it's active. But it's so big that it's easier to talk only to ourselves. You know, we go to WordCamps and we learn about WordPress. I go to WordCamps. I also go to other software conferences. And you know, developers of Ruby and Rails, Java and Spring, Python and Django. You regularly see them intermingling at conferences and learning from each other. I was at the Philadelphia Emerging Technologies for the Enterprise Conference a few weeks ago. I didn't meet any other WordPress developers there. I'm a pretty gregarious guy. I try to meet people. I don't see WordPress people at events outside of WordPress. I'd like to see more of that happen and getting those conversations going across languages, across platforms. There's a lot we can learn from each other. And so I understand the history of why WordPress is the way it is, and you know, backwards compatibility is extremely important. They can't just go and change the structure of WordPress. It's very important to maintain that backwards compatibility. But evolution is possible. It's about maintaining backwards compatibility. So I don't really see a compelling reason for WordPress to continue forever on this divergent path. I would like to see it over time start to go in the same direction as the rest of the software community, or at least have a good conversation going about why it's different. So that's my case for independent architecture. When you're working on your plugins or other aspects of WordPress, try to think that you're writing a piece of software that happens to work with WordPress. And then you may find yourself having broader conversations about what are the best practices for my software development. That's number 9. Number 10, my last one, is practice, practice, practice. I added this slide this morning. Last night I went to the Station Inn. I saw Eric Brace and Peter Cooper perform. They were great. And that's what, seeing them is actually what gave me the inspiration to write this slide. This is somebody's blisters for practicing the guitar. And musicians don't play only when they're on stage. They practice all the time. To get good at something, you need time to refine your craft when you're not under pressure to perform. So when you're at work, doing something for your boss, doing something for your client, you're under that pressure. You know, it's like being on stage. So it's important to be able to perform well, in that environment, but the way you get there is to have time to practice on your own when you're not under that pressure. So you can learn, and you can grow. You can take the time to read a blog post or something, to read a chapter from a book, to grow your knowledge, to try something out and see what happens with it. If it doesn't work, you throw it out. But you're not doing it on somebody's clock. I know this just sounds like more work, but it's, I think, part of calling yourself a professional in any field of work. Imagine if downloading WordPress gave you blisters, so at least you don't have physical symptoms from this. I did this when I was learning a lot of these sort of clean code practices. I was in a management position at the time, so I couldn't just sit down and write code with the programmers. I had too many meetings to go to and that sort of thing, but I wanted to learn these things. And I rode a bus and a subway to work, and every morning I had my laptop, and as soon as I got to the bus stop, I opened up the laptop, I typed with one hand. I had 30 minutes to get from home to work, and that was my practice time. Hour a day, half hour back, before each work. And that's how I learned to do a lot of this stuff. There was no pressure from a project or a client with me working on my WordPress plugins because I love to do it anyway, and trying to teach myself some new skills. So I'm going to stop there. That's my talk. Are there any questions? I definitely said some things that some of you may not agree with, so please feel free to disagree with me.
Can you explain singletons?
Sure. The reason singletons have become popular in WordPress for plugin development is because WordPress is filled with global statements. So if you've ever looked in plugin development, you've probably done some of this, right? Global $WPDB or global $host. You're working with these global variables. And when something's global, that means it's out there for any function, any method, any plugin, any part of the system at any time can go out and grab that thing and work with it. Offhand, that may sound nice. Like, oh, I don't have to go make a request for something or see if it's private or public. I can just grab it and use it. So it has that convenience, but the downside is you don't know who else may be grabbing it and doing something to it and changing it at any time. It may not be what you thought it was going to be when your code gets to it. So the singleton pattern is a way to try to sort of push in an object-oriented approach. Like say you're working on your plugin, you say, I want to use classes, I want to use objects. But you may have a plugin where it's pretty important that there only be one instance of that plugin. You don't want other people creating more instances of your plugin without you being able to control that. So singleton is a way to do that. It's a way to basically say, it sets up a little called a factory, which is public and accessible. And if somebody asks for an instance of your plugin, the factory gives them one. And if somebody asks for another one, it checks and says, well, did I create one already? And if it did, it just gives the same one back. So it's controlling what's going on there. So that's kind of, without pulling the code, that's the explanation. There are problems with it. I won't spend too much time on it. Maybe we can talk later, but that's the basic idea of singleton.
What role do you think test-driven development has in developing code?
I think it has a huge role. I actually had slides on that in here before, but I took them out for time. For me, learning test-driven development was the hardest of these skills to pick up because I've been doing coding for 20 years, and it changes your mental relationship with the code. Normally it's like I am working on something, I'm going to figure it out, and when I'm done, then I will tie myself to the other bits of the system that need to interact with what I'm working on. Test-driven development reverses that whole mental process, where you start with the dependencies. The first thing your code has to do is talk to a test, which is analogous to talking to other parts of the system. So from the beginning, you're thinking about that interface rather than thinking about the core problem. But I've done it in spurts, and then I fail, and then I go back to it. The nice thing is you can fall off the bandwagon and get right back on. But I have found when I do it, I always find value in it. The tricky part has been I know some things are harder to test than others. But anyway, just to bring this back to WordPress a bit, WordPress is very hard to do unit testing because of all its global state. It's hard to isolate the thing you want and work on just that. I wrote a plugin that uses, there are two testing frameworks for PHP. There's PHP Unit, which is a standard that's used in WordPress. And then there's an older one called Simple Test, which unfortunately has not been maintained. It hasn't been updated in a year. My plugin's around Simple Test. It's a shame it hasn't been has not been maintained because it has it's designed around a web UI, which is great. PHP Unit is command line, and when you're doing WordPress, most people aren't on the command line; they're in the browser. So Simple Test facilitates that. You can do your tests through the browser. For my own plugins, I have unit tests around many of them, and have done TD. Sometimes I've written the test afters, but I do try to write them before. So it's something I'm still feel myself at sort of an intermediate level with. But it's even valuable when you write them later. I have one plugin that does, it sends emails as part of what it does. And it didn't have any tests, and I picked apart. I'm like, I'm going to write a test for this part. And I thought it was like, this is going to be simple. I'm just warming up with this. And the first test, I found a security vault. I'm like, oh my God, like somebody could inject stuff into the headers right here. And I just never noticed it before. So it can be really valuable for pulling out those kinds of things. Yeah.
With test-driven stuff, especially with WordPress, like, I guess how do you write code that's testable? I just want to hear more about testing. I just want to hear more about testing.
Sure. I'm trying to decide how to answer it because the way I should clarify something. If you look at the WordPress Codex and they talk about unit tests for WordPress, WordPress itself, the core of WordPress, you keep seeing the phrase unit test, but they're not. They're integration tests. It's kind of an important distinction. Because of all the global statements in WordPress, WordPress itself, you really can't run unit tests. That if a unit test is you take a bit of code and you run it completely isolated from the rest of the system. But because WordPress has all these global variables, you can't isolate things. So when you try to do unit testing, what they call unit testing in WordPress, you need to set up the database. You need to set up the whole system and run it, which kind of raises to me, makes it, in some ways it makes it easier, because it's like, oh, it's just everything runs, but in other ways it's harder. Like, you got to set up a whole second system to test. With my own plugins, I write them in an object-oriented way. The tricky part with testing when you're doing it with WordPress is you're always calling WordPress hooks or functions. You want to inject a style sheet, or you want to put in a meta box, or whatever you're calling as WordPress functions. So it makes it hard to do unit testing, because as soon as you make that call, you're now testing WordPress. You don't want to be testing WordPress. You want to be testing your code. So the way I solved that problem was using a design pattern called the facade pattern, which basically means I don't call WordPress directly. So if I wanted to put in a style sheet, I have my own little function that basically just calls the WordPress function. It just becomes this layer that's basically just, it's from the perspective of my code, it looks almost like calling the WordPress functions, but I'm actually just calling my own wrapper around those WordPress functions. But what that allows me to do is now I can separate myself from WordPress. I can say, okay, pretend WordPress returned this value. Now what happens? And I can say, okay, pretend WordPress returned that value. Now what happens? So I can go through all the possible things, the good things that could happen, the bad things that could happen. I can very easily pretend I'm getting different responses from WordPress. And that's what it means to do unit testing.
Do you have that on GitHub by any chance?
I have it in the repository.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean
use the facade
Oh,
pattern?
yes, I do.
Great.
Although I don't have a complete coverage for all the WordPress functions, as I run into things, I add them to my facade. It's called, I put my name on it. It's still got plugin libraries for WordPress. It's got the facade pattern. It's got a class autoloader. It's a little bag of things to help you do object-oriented programming in WordPress.
Awesome. Thanks.
I just wanted to, you had a point where you said, you know, you're supposed to leave the campground cleaner than what you found it.
Yeah.
And I think that's great, and I think engineers realize that. But the reason I think people don't do it is because you go in there and you constantly thinking, okay, I'm changing stuff around, you know, I'm gonna break this stuff, and then I have to stay late to kind of fix bugs I found. And I think that's where his point comes in very handy. If you have test-driven development, you kind of liberated from that fear of breaking stuff because you can just run your regression tests. And I think that's why it's, that was my point, that I think it's very important to have test-driven development when trying to write clean code.
Yeah, that's a really good point, so thanks for bringing that up, because the fear people have when they try to do the Boy Scout rule is what you just said. Like, if I change the name of this thing, or like, am I going to break something else? So if you have like test coverage around your code, you can immediately say, well, we'll run all my tests. Did anything break? You can have that confidence to change things. You can mitigate that fear a little bit, even if you don't have tests. If you have a good IDE, like PHP Storm is a pretty good one. So you can say, change this variable name, or, you know, they call it a refactoring. You can refactor it. It will search through the code and look for anything that's calling this, and alert you and say, okay, I'm going to change it here, and I'm going to change it in all these other places. Should it, you know, let you stop it if you want to, but it's letting you know it's going to not just change this one file, but it's going to look through the whole project and update the names of everything related to that. So that's a way to help a little bit. But still,
do you have any tips for engineers to kind of talk to the managers and explain to them, you know, why this is important? Because I think it's important for engineers to hear this talk, but it's just as important for managers to hear this talk, because I feel like a lot of times they don't understand, you know, why it's important to take longer.
Yeah, there's a great story at the introduction to a book called Clean Coder, and it's sort of a war story from this guy about talking about this big project they were rolling out, and the managers in there like basically cracking the whip on the developers, like, will you get this done? Come on, guys, come on. It's rushing, and they're not doing clean code. And then, like, you know, the launch date gets moved up, and they work even harder, and they stay late, and they rush through, and they get it done. And then the day comes to launch, and they're like, oh, no, we're holding up the project because the lawyers still need to sign off on something. So, like, the lawyers, but this is a difference in how the professions are perceived. Like, the lawyers get sort of instantaneous respect. Like, the lawyers are like, oh, we have to stop and review this and make sure we are fully compliant with all the rules. Like, we have to do this right. And people instantly respect what lawyers say. Or what a programmer said. Just hire someone else. $20 an hour on, you know, I'll go look someone up online and get someone else to do it. So it is a little, I'm using that example because it's a hard problem to solve. You do need to have managers who are at least open to have a conversation. I think that the analogies I have used are pretty powerful. I found them helpful. You know, talk about the analogy of the doctor to the accountant. Like, we have these good practices, and it just takes a certain amount of time to do something properly. And you can say, oh, and if they're maybe forcing you to say, look, well, it's got to be done tomorrow, or if you're fired, you can say, okay, I will stay up late, I will do this, but understand that you're not giving me time to really do this the right way. And if there are bugs the next day, you know, you have to have some responsibility here for that. Because they would love to just push it off on you, right? So it's important to have that conversation.
I think the important consideration there is you're going to deal with those issues now or later. You have a choice of when. You can either deal with them now, by taking the time to design to standards and testing up front, or you can spend 2, 3, 5, 10 times as long dealing with them later. If you didn't do that, now you have to fix the bugs. And that's what the decision makers and managers have to understand. You have to quantify that for them and say, it may take me an additional 8 hours now to do it right, or I can spend 40 hours later when we have an issue. You tell me which one you want me to do.
The term for that is technical debt. you want me to go into technical debt? I can rush this through, but now we're creating this debt, and at some point we've got to pay it.
I was going to add another quick comment to that. I'm a company owner, but also a core developer, and there's the idea that if we're creating art and it's never done, that's the other challenge as well. It's like, we'll back it 19 times, but if it doesn't impact the bottom line, create more revenue, or actually improve security, or something you can point to,
Right.
we're just wasting time.
Right.
We could serve the customers better by adding a feature or something else. So there's that balance that I don't think there ever is going to be an easy solution. I think the most important part is managers and even technical owners of a technical company need to understand technology. They need to understand the pros and cons and say, there is a payment that I'm going to have to make to the technical debt at some point.
Right.
But at the same time, we have to stay pragmatic and we have to push out features to serve people. We can't just keep refactoring the code because it's fun and we're an artist and we want to make it that much better. We're still not proud of it or whatever.
Right.
So just, I think those conversations are worth having over and over and over again until eventually you get the team on the same page.
Yeah, I mean, I'm at a startup right now, so we have to be fast, and we work in weekly sprints, and really pretty much every day I'm checking in with my boss. I'm like, this is what I got done. Like, there's an expectation in the morning of what's going to be done that night, and when he and I both came into the project, we inherited a code base from previous people that had there were no tests. All the stuff was a mess, and it was like, but it worked. I mean, that's the good and the bad thing about legacy code is like, well, it may be messy, but we know it's out there, it's working. So you're kind of on pins and needles changing it. So we have, taken the mindset of, slow and steady wins the race. Try to work cleanly as we go, and clean up bits as we work on it. And then sometimes things change. Like there's a big chunk of the code that, we're startup, so we change direction sometimes. Like, oh, that thing that was a headache a month ago, like now that's not even mine, So we've really just taken the approach of, what's in front of us now, let's do that well. Let's clean up some dependencies around it to the extent we feel safe doing that, and just chip away at it.
I want to add one thing to this most recent conversation here. I think I started my business 9 years ago, and I've had to learn, and I continually have to work on these skills, which is a whole other thing besides the technical stuff I do on my computer, and that is manage client expectations.
Yes.
Be upfront with them from the get-go, even when I know they don't want to hear what I have to say. I dealt with that yesterday.
Yeah.
And I confronted these people directly and politely as possible. This is the South, so I have to sort of pour sugar on everything I say, even add smiley faces, even though it goes against my grain. And I have to let them know at the beginning that I am going to talk to them directly, and that nothing, and I always say nothing benefits from being rushed.
Right.
You want to meet this deadline?
Yeah.
It's a collaborative effort. I have to go through that all the time with people, and it's hard to do. I'd much rather hide behind my computer screen and code and make graphics and things, but I have to get out in front of those people and talk to them really sometimes.
Right.
And that's another skill set.
Yeah. It's hard because this is sort of, to get us into a whole other presentation, estimation is hard. It's a big part of it.
Oh, yeah.
It's hard to know how long something will take. And there are techniques to help with that, which I want to talk at lunch or tonight. Talk
Experience is.
Yeah, but there are also some techniques you can follow to help with the estimation part. But then the other part is just, most people perceive programming as a sort of magic. And they're like, oh, just go code it.
Well,
Why does it take a month,
meetings, I'll show them
yeah.
code, and it scares them.
Yeah.
And I'll start talking about it,
Right.
and they really
Well,
don't want to hear that. So,
Great. Something I use often with dealing with clients is because it's pretty easy to understand, is the project management triangle. Have you ever seen the triangle? It's basically, there's three sides to it. There's cost, there's, money,
right.
there's time, and there's features. So because everybody basically wants everything for as little money as possible, as quickly as possible, with as many features as possible. And the response to that basically is pick any two. Pick two
That's
out of
right.
three. If you want it all, if the features are most important, well, it's going to take longer, or it's going to cost more.
Yeah.
If the schedule's most important, well, maybe we don't do all the features first.
Yeah.
There's a trade-off between the three, and you have to
Yeah.
pick which one you're willing to give on. They have to be willing to give on one of the three sides of the triangle. you know, because that's the real world. That's often a really good way to ground the conversation. Yeah.
Do you have any specific resources that were helpful in your journey to learning clean code?
Yeah, one is where I stole the title from, which is a book called Clean Code. And, you know, it's not particular to PHP or WordPress. In fact, most of the examples are in Java and C, but they're all simple. I mean, you don't have to know Java to understand them. But it's a really nice combination of things that I try to communicate in this talk, a mix of like concrete examples of code, but then also like how you think about managing the project, how you work with your clients. Like, because all those elements go into a successful project.
Right.
So that's a good place to start. What else is good? There's a book, it's actually a Ruby book on RSpec, which is the testing framework for Ruby and Rails. If you don't mind looking at Ruby code, it's actually I found it to be the best overview of like a completely holistic way to approach like unit testing and integration testing and understanding the difference and when to do one and when to do the other. So even though it's in Ruby, the workflow that it lays out is applicable really to any tool set. That's the name of the book. I think it's just called the RSpec book. There are others that have to do with agile software development, which is more the workflow side,
Right.
as opposed to the code side. I don't know if you're interested in that.
I'm interested in it all.
Yeah. Look up the name Mike Cohn, C-O-H-N. He's written a lot of books on agile software development. And it's not at the code level, it's the workflow. And I found all to be very valuable as well.
Awesome.
I think that's it.
Okay.
Yeah, I bet you're around though later for questions.
Yeah.
So,
Around at lunchtime and all day and after party.
thank you, Michael, very much.